There are places where time refuses to move forward, rooms that hold their breath, calendars frozen on a single, unbearable date. For Andrea Eilber's family, November 16th, 2011, became that moment, the day their world split cleanly into before and after. She was 20 years old, with her whole life stretched out before her like an open road. She had gone to help family, to do a simple favor in a quiet Michigan township where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. But somewhere in those November hours, in a house that wasn't even her own, someone came. Someone whose face she may never have known. Someone who would vanish into the ordinary fabric of American life for 12 long years, while a family learned to breathe around the shape of their loss. This is a story of how silence can stretch across a decade, and how science can finally give voice to the dead. But after years of darkness, a single cigarette but would shatter everything. Before I tell you what happened, comment your country and time below. The autumn of 2011 arrived in Mayfield Township the way it always did, gradually, then all at once. The sugar maples along Kings Mill Road turned from green to gold to rust, their leaves letting go in swirling cascades whenever the wind pushed through. By mid-November, the Michigan landscape had settled into that particular shade of gray that precedes winter, when the sky hangs low and close and daylight feels borrowed. Andrea Eilber had never been afraid of quiet places. At 20, she carried herself with the easy confidence of someone still discovering who she might become. She had her mother's smile and her father's stubbornness. Friends would later say, a young woman who showed up when she said she would, who remembered birthdays, who could make you laugh without trying too hard. She wasn't particularly tall or particularly loud. She didn't chase attention. She was, in the most beautiful sense of the word, ordinary, the kind of person whose absence would leave a hole shaped exactly like themselves. When her aunt and uncle asked if she could house sit for a few days while they traveled, Andrea didn't hesitate. The house on Kings Mill Road sat on several acres of wooded property, far enough from neighbors to feel private, but not isolated. It was a kind of place where deer appeared at dusk and frost settled thick on the grass by morning. Her relatives trusted her. She was responsible, reliable. It was just a few days, just a favor. November 14th, 2011 was a Monday. The details of that day would later be reconstructed from phone records, from the last people who heard her voice, from the ordinary digital breadcrumbs we all leave behind without thinking. Andrea had been at the house since the weekend. She'd checked in with family. She'd gone about the small tasks of temporary stewardship, watering plants, collecting mail, making sure the heat stayed on. There was no indication anything was wrong. No distress calls, no frantic messages, just the regular rhythm of a young woman going through an unremarkable day. But somewhere in those hours, between the last confirmed contact and the terrible silence that followed, someone came to a house on Kings Mill Road. There are moments that investigators will return to again and again, trying to parse meaning from emptiness. Did Andrea hear a car approaching on the gravel drive? Did she answer a knock at the door, thinking it might be a neighbor or delivery? Or did someone simply appear, uninvited, unwanted, in a space where she should have been safe? The house, with its walls and locks and the illusion of security, became a trap. What happened inside those rooms would remain locked away from the world, known only to Andrea and whoever crossed that threshold with violence in their heart. The attack was brutal. This is not sensational. This is the documented reality that investigators would later piece together from evidence and autopsy reports. Andrea Eilber did not die quickly or quietly. She fought. Her body would tell that story even when her voice could not. But whatever strength she had, whatever survival instinct kicked in, it wasn't enough. The person who came to Kings Mill Road that day had made a decision, and they carried it through to its terrible conclusion. When it was over, they left. They walked out of that house, past the autumn trees and the gray sky, and they disappeared into the vast anonymity of American life. They returned to jobs, perhaps to families, to routines. They woke up the next morning and the morning after that, carrying their secret like a stone in their pocket. Andrea's body was discovered on November 16, 2011, 2 days after the attack. Her aunt and uncle had returned home, expecting to find everything as they left it. Instead, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Lapeer County Sheriff's Office responded immediately. The house became a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, while investigators moved through the rooms with cameras and evidence bags and the grim professionalism required to document horror. The forensic work began immediately. Blood spatter pattern, fingerprint, trace evidence. Among the items collected was a cigarette but found at the scene, something that didn't belong to the family, something that suggested the presence of an outsider. In 2011, DNA technology was already sophisticated, but it had its limits. The genetic material from that cigarette was processed, logged, and entered into databases. Investigators waited for a match. None came. The case generated local news coverage, as all violent deaths do. Andrea's photograph appeared in newspapers and on television screen, her young face frozen in a moment of happiness that now felt impossibly distant. The community of Mayfield Township, a place where people generally knew their neighbors and doors were often left unlocked, reeled with a violation. Tips came in. Leads were followed. Investigators interviewed dozens of people, family, friends, acquaintances, anyone who might have had contact with Andrea or the property. But no clear suspect emerged. There was no obvious motive, no known enemy, no recent conflicts or threatening behavior. Andrea had been a young woman living her life, and someone had destroyed that life seemingly at random. The worst kind of crime for investigators to solve. One without clear connection, without the usual threads of relationship or revenge or financial gain that can be pulled until they lead somewhere. Weeks became months. The intensive investigation began to slow, not from lack of effort, but from lack of direction. Every lead had been pursued to its end, every possible angle explored. The DNA from the cigarette but remained in the system, waiting for a match that never appeared. In law enforcement, there's a terrible term for cases like this. They go cold, not closed, not solved, just cold. The files remain open, the evidence stored, but active investigation ceases. Resources shift to newer crimes, fresher trails. By the end of 2011, Andrea Eilber's murder had become another unsolved case in Lapeer County. Her killer was out there somewhere, breathing free air, while Andrea was buried, and her family began the impossible work of figuring out how to continue living. The house on Kings Mill Road stood empty for a long time after that. Some places, once marked by violence, never feel the same again. The trees still change with the season. The frost still came. But the innocence of that quiet corner of Michigan had been shattered, and no amount of time could put it back together. Grief is not a linear thing. It doesn't arrive all at once and then depart on schedule the way we might wish it would. Instead, it comes in waves, sometimes expected, sometimes ambushing you in a grocery store aisle, or during a commercial, or in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. For Andrea Eilber's family, grief became a permanent resident, a presence that reshaped the architecture of their lives. The first year was a blur of impossible firsts. The first Thanksgiving without her. The first Christmas where her stocking hung empty or didn't hang at all. The first birthday that went uncelebrated, except perhaps with tears and candles lit in her memory. Andrea's aunt and uncle, who had asked her to house sit, carried a particular burden. The what-ifs haunted them. What if they hadn't traveled? What if they'd asked someone else? What if they'd come home a day earlier? These questions have no good answer. Guilt is irrational when it comes to tragedy. We know intellectually that we cannot control the actions of others, cannot predict violence, cannot shoulder responsibility for the choices made by people with darkness in their heart. But knowing this doesn't stop the guilt from settling in, doesn't prevent it from whispering in quiet moments. You should have known. You should have prevented this. You should have protected her. The investigation for the family became a torturous exercise in hope and disappointment. Every time the phone rang, hearts would jump. Every time a detective reached out for a follow-up question, the possibility sparked. Maybe this is it. Maybe they found something. Maybe today is the day we learn who did this. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the updates became less frequent. Not because the sheriff's office didn't care. Investigators hate unsolved cases, particularly violent ones, but because there was simply nowhere else to go. The media attention faded, as it always does. In the immediate aftermath of Andrea's murder, local news outlets covered the story extensively. But news is ephemeral by nature, constantly replaced by the next tragedy, the next scandal, the next weather event. Within months, Andrea's name appeared less and less frequently. Within a year, it barely appeared at all. This is its own kind of death, the death of public memory. The way a person can disappear twice, first from life and then from collective consciousness. But families don't forget. They can't forget, even when they might wish for the mercy of amnesia. Andrea's parents kept her room largely untouched for years. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her books remained on their shelves. Photographs covered the walls. Andrea as a baby, as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman she'd been on her last day. These spaces become shrines, not in a religious sense, but in an emotional one. Places where memory is preserved, where the loss can still be felt, where the boundary between past and present grows thin. Every year on November 16th, the family marked the anniversary of her death. Some years publicly, attending memorial services, or organizing community vigils. Other years privately, gathering together to share memories and tears. There's a particular cruelty to these anniversaries. They force you to relive the worst day of your life on schedule, year after year, while the rest of the world moves on without noticing. Friends meant well, but their comfort had limits. In the early days, people showed up with casseroles and condolences, filled the house with their presence and their own discomfort, with death. But as time passed, the visits became less frequent. Not because people stopped caring, but because they didn't know what to say anymore. Grief makes people uncomfortable. It reminds them of their own mortality, their own vulnerability. So they pull back, not from cruelty, but from self-protection. And the grieving family finds itself increasingly isolated, surrounded by people who want to help but don't know how. Andrea's case file sat in Lapeer County Sheriff's Office, one folder among many. Detectives who had worked the initial investigation moved on to other assignments, retired, or left the force entirely. New investigators came in, unfamiliar with the detail, focused on current cases. This is the nature of law enforcement. There's always another crime, always another victim needing attention right now. Cold cases wait. The cigarette, but with its precious DNA evidence, remained in storage. In those years, genetic genealogy was beginning to emerge as a tool for law enforcement, but it was still in its infancy. The technique, using DNA databases and family trees to identify suspects through their relatives, wouldn't become widely used for criminal investigations until the late 2010s. In 2011, 2012, 2013, the technology simply wasn't there yet, or at least not accessible enough for most agencies to employ. So the evidence waited, and the family waited. There's a particular kind of limbo that comes with an unsolved murder. Closure. That word everyone uses but few can define remains impossible. There's no one to be angry at except an unknown shadow. No trial to attend. No conviction to bring a sense of justice. However incomplete, just an open wound that time cannot close because the questions remain unanswered. Who? Why? Where are they now? Some family members struggle with faith during this time. How could God allow such a thing? How could a just universe permit a young woman to be killed for no reason and her killer to walk free? These are ancient questions, the same ones posed by Job, by every parent who has buried a child, by everyone who has faced the apparently random cruelty of existence. Some found comfort in religion, others lost it entirely. There is no right way to reconcile tragedy with belief. The community of Mayfield Township gradually returned to normal the way communities do. The shock wore off. The heightened vigilance faded. People started leaving their doors unlocked again. Life, with its relentless forward momentum, continued. But for those who had known Andrea, for neighbors on Kings Mill Road who remembered the day the police cars arrived, there remained a lingering unease, a reminder that safety is always partial, always conditional, always subject to forces beyond our control. Years accumulated like dust. Andrea would have been 25, then 30. Her friends got married, had children, advancing careers. The life she should have lived existed only as a ghost of possibility, a parallel timeline that her family couldn't help but imagine. What would she be doing now? Who would she have become? These questions multiplied with every passing year, creating not just one loss but thousands, all the futures that would never be. By 2020, nearly a decade had passed. The case was thoroughly cold. The original investigators had long since moved on. The file sat in storage, periodically reviewed, but without active lead. Andrea's family had learned to function with their grief, though it never truly lessened. You don't get over losing someone to murder. You only get through it day by day, learning to carry weight that never gets lighter. But then, in the early 2020s, something began to shift in law enforcement circles. Genetic genealogy had proven itself spectacularly effective in the 2018 capture of the Golden State Killer, a case that had been cold for decades until DNA and family tree research identified Joseph D'Angelo. Suddenly, law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting their old cases, wondering if this new technique might crack mysteries that had seemed unsolvable. The Lapeer County Sheriff's Office, like many departments, began to review its cold cases with fresh eyes and new tools. Andrea Eilber's case was among them. The cigarette, but preserved all these years, suddenly became more than just evidence. It became a key. In 2022, detectives made the decision to submit the DNA profile for genetic genealogy analysis. This wasn't a simple process. It required working with specialized labs and genealogists who could take the genetic markers and begin building family tree, looking for connections, following lines of descent until they could narrow down potential suspects. The work was painstaking and slow, but for the first time in over a decade, the case was moving again. Someone was actively working to find Andrea's killer. When the family learned that the investigation had been reopened, that new technology was being applied, hope sparked. Cautious, fragile hope, tempered by years of disappointment. They had learned not to expect too much, but they couldn't help hoping anyway. After all this time, after all this silence, perhaps there would finally be an answer. The science of genetic genealogy operates on a simple but powerful premise. We are all connected to each other through invisible threads of DNA, and those threads can be followed backward through time to find common ancestors. When a crime scene yields DNA, that genetic profile becomes a map, uploaded to genealogical databases where people have voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry research, and you can identify distant relatives of the person who left that DNA behind. From there, It's detective work, building family trees, identifying branches, narrowing down possibilities, until you find someone who was in the right place at the right time. The process is neither quick nor simple. Genealogists working on Andrea's case began with the DNA from the cigarette, but found at the scene. They identified distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the unknown person, but were several generations removed. Then came the painstaking work of building family trees, using birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, and any other documentation that could trace lines of descent. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The DNA pointed toward a family line, and within that line, investigators began to identify male candidates who would have been adults in 2011 and who had some connection to Michigan or the Midwest. This is where traditional detective work merged with cutting-edge science. Background checks were run. Locations were verified. Alibis, where possible, were examined. The pool of potential suspects narrowed from hundreds to dozens to a handful, and then to one name, Chadwick Shane Mobley. He was not a person the family had ever heard of, not a friend, not an acquaintance, not even a distant connection they could trace. If Mobley had ever crossed paths with Andrea Eilber before November 14th, 2011, there was no evidence of it. This was a scenario investigators had suspected all along. A random attack, a stranger killing, the worst kind of nightmare because it suggested no reason, no logic, just bad luck and bad timing. But now they had a name. Mobley had been living in Montana, over 1,000 miles from Michigan, when investigators identified him in 2023. He'd been there for years, living an apparently ordinary life, working, paying taxes, existing in plain sight, while Andrea's family suffered in limbo. This is one of the haunting realities of unsolved crime. The killer doesn't stop existing. They continue on day after day, year after year, while their victims are frozen in time. The next step was confirmation. Genetic genealogy provides strong lead, but it's not enough for prosecution on its own. Investigators needed a direct DNA match to prove definitively that Mobley was the person who had left that cigarette but at the scene. The process of obtaining that confirmation through surveillance, discarded items, or cooperation must have been tense. One wrong move and a suspect could flee or destroy evidence. One legal misstep and the whole case could collapse. But the investigators were careful. They obtained a direct DNA sample from Mobley, and when it was compared to the DNA from the cigarette, but the match was conclusive. 12 years after Andrea's murder, after thousands of days of waiting and wondering, her family finally had an answer to the most basic question. Who? The arrest took place in Montana in 2023. Chadwick Shane Mobley was taken into custody and extradited back to Michigan to face charges. The news broke in Lapeer County like a thunderclap. A case that had been cold for over a decade suddenly hot again. A murder that people had almost gotten thrust back into public consciousness. For Andrea's family, the notification from law enforcement brought a complicated rush of emotion. Relief that someone had been caught. Anger that had taken so long. Grief fresh and raw all over again as the details of Andrea's death were dredged back up, and underneath it all, a kind of exhaustion, the weight of carrying this for 12 years, and now the prospect of carrying it further through a trial and its aftermath. Mobley was charged with multiple counts related to Andrea's murder. The evidence against him was circumstantial but strong. The DNA match, placing him at the scene at the time of the killing. There was no clear motive, no obvious connection, nothing to explain why it targeted Andrea specifically, or what had brought him to Kings Mill Road that November day. Perhaps he would never offer an explanation. Perhaps there was no explanation that would make sense. Sometimes violence is simply senseless. The case began to wind its way through the legal system. Arraignment, preliminary hearing, the slow machinery of justice grinding forward. Andrea's family prepared themselves for a trial, knowing it would mean reliving the worst details of her death, hearing forensic testimony, seeing crime scene photographs. These are the costs of justice. It doesn't come gently or quietly. It demands that victims be examined and discussed like evidence, that families sit and listen while strangers dissect the loss that shattered their world. But before a trial could begin, something shifted. In February 2025, 14 years after Andrea's murder, Chadwick Shane Mobley entered a plea of no contest to the charges against him. This legal maneuver, different from a guilty plea, but carrying the same weight for sentencing purposes, meant that Mobley would not admit guilt but would not contest the prosecution's case. For prosecutors, it guaranteed a conviction without the uncertainty of a trial. For the defense, it might have seemed like the best option given the strength of the DNA evidence. For Andrea's family, it was a bitter kind of resolution. There would be no trial, no opportunity to hear testimony, no moment in court where Mobley might be forced to explain himself. But there would also be no drawn-out legal battle, no risk of a hung jury or technicality that might set him free. The plea meant certainty, and after 12 years of uncertainty, that had its own value. Sentencing was scheduled for April 2025. The courtroom in Lapeer County was full on the day of Chadwick Shane Mobley's sentencing. Andrea's family sat together in the front row, a united presence that spoke to years of shared grief and the strength required to reach this moment. Behind them, friends and community members filled the gallery. People who had known Andrea, people who had followed the case, people who simply felt compelled to witness this particular iteration of justice. The media was there too, cameras and reporters documenting an ending that had been delayed by over a decade. Mobley sat at the defense table, his expression largely unreadable. In photographs and news footage from the proceedings, he appeared as an ordinary middle-aged man, unremarkable in features and bearing. This is often the case with people who commit terrible acts. They don't look like monsters. They look like anyone else. This ordinariness is itself unsettling, a reminder that violence doesn't announce itself in obvious ways, that danger can wear a completely mundane face. Victim impact statements are a standard part of sentencing in serious crime. They give the family and loved ones of victims a chance to address the court, to put into words what the crime has cost them, to make the abstract concept of harm tangibly personal. For Andrea's family, these statements were an opportunity they had waited years to have, a chance to speak directly about what had been taken from them. The statement, delivered with whatever composure could be mustered, likely touched on familiar themes: the emptiness Andrea's absence created, the milestone she never reached, the pain of holidays and birthdays marked by her not being there, the years of not knowing, of looking at strangers and wondering if one of them might be the killer, the relief of finally having answers, and the anger that those answers came so late. Each word was a small reclamation of voice in a situation where the family had been rendered voiceless for so long. The prosecutor laid out the case clearly for the judge, emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the impact on the family, and the 12 years that Mobley had remained free while they suffered. The DNA evidence was ironclad. There was no doubt about his presence at the scene. The request was for the maximum sentence allowable under law. The defense, limited in what they could argue given the no-contest plea, likely focus on factors that might inspire some measure of leniency, though in a case like this, with such overwhelming evidence and such a serious crime, leniency was an unlikely prospect. Perhaps they mentioned Mobley's lack of violent criminal history before this, though that would ring hollow given the severity of what he'd done to Andrea. Perhaps they asked for mercy in sentencing, though what mercy could be offered to someone who had shown none? When the judge spoke, the decision was clear and unequivocal. Chadwick Shane Mobley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second chances, no early release. He would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars, confined to a cell, stripped of freedom, punished for the violence he had inflicted on a young woman whose only crime was being in the wrong place when evil came calling. The sentence was both an ending and a beginning for the legal system. It marked the successful resolution of a cold case, a testament to the power of persistence and new technology. For law enforcement, it was validation that keeping evidence, maintaining cold case files, and being willing to employ new investigative technique can yield results even after many years. For the wider community, it was a restoration of order, a sense that even delayed justice is still justice. But for Andrea's family, the emotional calculus was more complicated. There was relief, certainly. The man who had killed their daughter, their niece, their loved one, would face consequences. He would not be free to hurt anyone else. He would not get to live a full life, while Andrea's had been cut brutally short. In that sense, the sentence provided a form of balance, a cosmic correction where there had been only imbalance for so long. There was also closure, though that word feels insufficient. Closure suggests something can be fully closed, that a chapter can end completely. The reality is messier. Yes, they now knew who and they knew why he would be punished. But Andrea was still gone. The years of not knowing couldn't be recovered. The grief didn't disappear just because justice had been served. If anything, the trial and sentencing process had ripped open wounds that started to scar over, forcing the family to confront her death in its most explicit details all over again. And there was anger at Mobley for taking Andrea from them, at the passage of time, at the randomness of violence, at a universe that allows young women to be murdered in houses where they should have been safe. Anger isn't always rational or productive, but it's valid. It's part of the grieving process. And for Andrea's family, anger had been building for 14 years. The question of motive remained unanswered. Mobley offered no explanation for why he had gone to the house on Kings Mill Road that November day. No insight into what had driven him to commit such violence. Perhaps he didn't know himself. Perhaps the reasons were so banal: opportunity, impulse, darkness, that no explanation would satisfy. Or perhaps he simply chose silence, the last act of control available to him. This absence of motive is its own form of cruelty, leaving the family without even the cold comfort of understanding understand it. In the days and weeks following the sentencing, the media coverage gradually faded again, as it always does. Andrea's case became another true crime story, told and retold in articles and documentaries and podcast episodes. Her name would live on in that peculiar modern way, preserved in digital archives, searchable, always accessible, but also somewhat flattened, reduced to the basic fact of a murder and its resolution. This is both a gift and a burden for family. Their loved one is remembered, but remembered primarily for how they died rather than how they lived. The house on Kings Mill Road, which had stood largely empty for years after murder, eventually returned to normal use. Houses are just structures. After all, they don't retain evil. Even when evil acts occur within them, the trees still change with the season. The frost still comes. Life, with its stubborn persistence, continued. For Andrea's family, the process of moving forward has no clear roadmap. Grief experts talk about stages and timelines, but the truth is more individual. Some days are manageable. Other days the loss feels fresh as ever. The sentencing provided a marker, a sense that this chapter has reached some form of conclusion, but it doesn't erase the previous 14 years or the lifetime that stretches ahead without Andrea in it. What the case does represent more broadly is the evolving nature of justice in the modern age. The science of genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigation, bringing resolution to families who had given up hope and bringing accountability to people who thought they had escaped consequences. Since the Golden State Killer case in 2018, dozens of cold cases have been solved using these techniques. The technology is not without controversy. Questions about privacy, about the voluntary DNA databases being used for purposes their contributors never intended, about the ethics of surveillance in the genetic age. These are important conversations that society must have. But for families like Andrea's, the ethical complexities are secondary to the simple fact of result. After 12 years of nothing, genetic genealogy gave them a name. It gave them answers. It gave them the opportunity to see Andrea's killer face justice. That mattered. It matters immensely. The case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence, even when cases go cold. That cigarette butt, carefully stored for over a decade, became the key that unlocked everything. If it had been discarded or lost, if the chain of custody had been broken, Mobley might never have been identified. This is a lesson for law enforcement agencies everywhere. Maintain cold case files. Preserve DNA evidence. Keep hoping for breakthrough. The technology that can solve a case might not exist yet, but it might exist in 5 years or 10 or 20. There's a tendency in true crime stories to look for larger meaning, to extract lessons or morals from tragedy. The truth is, some events resist easy interpretation. Andrea Eilber was killed for no reason that makes sense, by someone who had no apparent connection to her, in a crime that was random and senseless. The fact that her killer was eventually caught doesn't change the fundamental injustice of her death or restore the life that was taken from her, but it does demonstrate something about persistence and the long arc of justice. It shows that cases can remain solvable even after years of being cold. It shows that families who refuse to give up hope, who keep pushing for answers, can sometimes see that hope rewarded. It shows that the work of detectives and forensic scientists and genealogists matters, that their efforts have real consequences for real people. And it shows that even in an age of instant gratification and constant stimulation, some things require patience and time, and the willingness to keep working when success seems impossible. Andrea's aunt and uncle, who have carried the weight of her death in their home for 14 years, can perhaps find some measure of peace now. The what-ifs and the guilt haven't disappeared, but they exist alongside the knowledge that justice was eventually served. The house on Kings Mill Road, which became the site of unimaginable tragedy, no longer houses quite so many ghosts. The community of Mayfield Township, which was shaken by a murder that seemed random and inexplicable, can take some comfort in knowing the killer has been identified and punished. And Andrea herself, who was denied the chance to grow old, to fulfill her potential, to live the life she should have had, she is remembered, not just as a victim, though that's part of her story, but as a daughter, a niece, a friend, a young woman with dreams and flaws, and everything that makes us human. Her family ensures that her memory extends beyond the crime scene photographs and forensic reports, that she remains a full person in their hearts and mind. The final chapter of this story was written in a Montana courtroom in April 2025, when a judge sentenced Chadwick Shane Mobley to life in prison. But the story itself, in its truest sense, is still being written in the daily act of remembrance by Andrea's family, in the ongoing work of cold case investigators across the country, in the evolving technology that continues to bring answers to unsolvable questions. Justice came late for Andrea Eilber, 14 years late, but it came. In the end, this case reminds us that the arc of justice bends slowly, and sometimes it requires science to help it bend at all. For over a decade, Andrea Eilber's family lived in the terrible limbo of not knowing, suspended between hope and despair, waiting for answers that seemed like they might might never come. The technology that eventually solved her case didn't exist in any practical form when she was killed. The investigators who identified her killer hadn't even joined the case yet. Everything required new techniques, persistent work, and simple refusal to let the case be forgotten took time to align. But when those elements came together, they brought with them a reckoning that Chadwick Shane Mobley likely never anticipated. He had gotten away with murder for 12 years. He'd built a life in Montana, far from the scene of his crime, perhaps believing that enough time and distance would protect him. He was wrong. The past caught up with him, pulled forward by strands of DNA too small to see, but powerful enough to bring him to justice. For families waiting on answers in unsolved cases across the country, Andrea's story offers both hope and a sobering reminder of how long justice can take. Not every cold case will be solved. Not every family will get the closure that the Eilbers eventually receive, but some will. And the longer we preserve evidence, the more we invest in cold case unit, the more we employ cutting-edge forensic technology, the more those families will finally hear the words they've been desperate to hear. We found him. Andrea Eilber was 20 years old when she died, doing a favor for family in a quiet Michigan township. She deserved to live. She deserved to grow old. She deserved all the futures that were stolen from her on that November day. We can't give her those things back, but we can remember her. We can honor her by telling her story. And we can take some measure of comfort in knowing that the person who took her life will spend the rest of his own behind bars. Justice may arrive late, but it doesn't vanish. And in a world where so much seems uncertain, where violence can strike randomly and senselessly, that truth is worth holding on to for Andrea, for her family, and for everyone still waiting in the dark for answers that science, persistence, and time might someday bring to light.